Good afternoon, dear viewers. This is the Ruslan Belov channel. In today's broadcast, we will examine the situation on the Ukrainian theatre of military operations as of February 14, 2026. Over the past 24 hours, a whole series of significant events have been recorded, so let us begin our analysis. Today was once again marked by the active arrival of reports and data from the Zaporizhia sector, where for several days in a row now, Ukrainian forces have been attempting counter-offensive actions. The situation on this direction is of particular interest, since assessments of the situation among various sources diverge dramatically. Naturally, pro-Ukrainian information resources have long been depicting virtually the entire territory as liberated almost all the way to Mariupol itself. This is quite predictable and understandable. If we turn to pro-Russian sources of information, the positions on the front line remain unchanged. Individual independent cartographic services are attempting to make some adjustments in one direction or another. However, overall the situation is shrouded in a dense fog of war, and what is really happening on the Zaporizhia section of combat operations remains absolutely unclear and uncertain. First and foremost, this is due to the absence of reliable communication with forward positions, and also, in all likelihood, the desire of both warring sides to maintain a certain regime of secrecy for security reasons. Nevertheless, there are a number of highly informative Telegram resources, including pro-Russian channels connected with the Vostok East Force grouping, which publish and provide detailed reports on the state of affairs on the line of contact. According to these reports, information is confirmed that Ukrainian forces are currently conducting a large-scale counter-offensive on this direction, and Russian information resources are calling for the observance of informational discipline, since this entire situation is hindering the conduct of operations on the specified section. As for pro-Ukrainian sources, until February 14th, publications about the occurring events were posted predominantly by independent, not particularly well-known cartographers and analysts. But today, for the first time since the beginning of combat clashes for the eastern Zaporizhia direction, pro-Ukrainian cartographers from the Deep State project made an adjustment on their map, according to which Ukrainian military formations managed, and now we are not talking about a breakthrough, today we are talking primarily about infiltration, that is, individual detachments as part of diversionary reconnaissance formations of the armed forces of Ukraine managed to approach even the village of Kalinovo. However, this is essentially all the information that we have already been discussing over the past several days. That is, today absolutely no new data appeared. This is merely, if one can put it this way, a duplication of everything we talked about earlier. Simply now the information is coming from somewhat different sources that probably possess more detailed information. This is how the cartographic situation looked by the end of February 13th, and this is how we are adjusting the map today. We are simply adding a grey zone, which indicates not that the Ukrainian side managed to literally break through the front line, but that at the present moment active combat clashes are taking place on this section, that Ukrainian military formations are attempting to penetrate through the combat formations of units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, which incidentally is also confirmed by the Vostok force grouping, more precisely by channels connected with this grouping, which report that the Ukrainian side is attempting to conduct an operation similar to the one we could observe in Sudzha. That is, I remind you, when the Sudzha offensive began, nobody was storming urban settlements there. Nobody was pushing through the front line by force. They simply tried to advance on armored vehicles as far as possible, as deep as possible, to get as close to Kursk as possible, to seize key transport arteries. That is, to penetrate as deeply as possible with individual detachments, individual military formations, consolidate positions, hold the lines, while more regular army units gradually advanced to all these key points. That is, an analogous operation is being conducted at the present moment. At least this is what various pro-Russian resources inform us. That is, the Ukrainian side is trying to infiltrate, however without entering settlements directly. Today it is reported there literally that all settlements have already been repainted. In reality, according to data from open sources, the Ukrainian side, on the contrary, is trying to bypass all settlements, all large strongpoints, and occupy positions actually in the rear of settlements, in the rear of strongpoints, in the rear of all main fortified areas, reaching supply lines, reaching the blocking of individual fortified areas, that is, creating actually a kind of partial encirclement. That is, an attempt to reach a conditional yellow line in the area of Kalinovsky and further in the direction of Radostnoye, yes, but without entering settlements, and an attempt to build such a sufficiently strong front line, defensive line, let us say, between Russian positions to the north and south, and subsequently, having cut off Russian formations from probable supply on this section, attempt movement already from the main part, from the direction of Pokrovsk, Velikomikhailovka, Rizdvianka, already to these positions with more significant and powerful forces. That is, this is precisely what is happening now, and this operation is what many are passing off as a breakthrough, almost a collapse of the front and so on and so forth. Nothing of the kind is happening at the present moment. Here, precisely now, are attempts at an outflanking maneuver. Well, we will track how the situation will develop further. The Russian side continues to publish video materials on which we can observe, possibly, individual episodes of combat clashes on this section. We see armored vehicles entering or attempting to exit onto positions of the Russian Federation under strikes of lancets, under attacks of unmanned aerial vehicles. However, I will emphasize once again that from this direction a very limited quantity of footage is arriving. Both sides are trying to observe a certain informational discipline, not allowing leakage of information outward, and this is primarily most likely connected with the fact that not everyone, in all likelihood, is confident, and also primarily the Ukrainian side, that this counter-offensive is capable of bringing substantial or enormous dividends. But we will observe how the situation will develop further. Next, we move to the Dnipropetrovsk direction. Today, from this section, small adjustments are arriving. According to pro-Ukrainian cartographic services, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to improve their positions from the border between the Donetsk region and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in the western direction, with the goal of bypassing and flanking the settlement of Podgorodnoye, as well as reaching the northern outskirts of the settlement of Balakovka, as well as toward the northern part of the settlement of Novonikolaevka. That is, the Russian army began gradually advancing, possibly toward the grouping of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, which at the present moment continues combat operations for the territory of the settlement of Novopavlovka. Next, we move to the Constantinovka section of the front, from where quite a lot of important information is arriving, which at this stage is quite difficult to assess and understand how to interpret it. Let us begin with video material published in the southeastern part of the city of Constantinovka. On these frames, we see a Ukrainian serviceman who claims that he is located in the southeastern part of the city of Constantinovka. His position was geolocated precisely at this point. A Ukrainian serviceman is standing and declaring that this part of the city of Constantinovka is under the full confident control of the armed forces of Ukraine. For now, we cannot assess this video material in any way. Perhaps individual analysts, not perhaps, but individual analysts are inclined toward the opinion that this video was created by means of artificial intelligence. Others claim that indeed here all the cartographers who made adjustments in this part of Constantinovka are not entirely correct. The information is not entirely reliable. That is, Ukrainian military units are still present here. And therefore, possibly in the near future, precisely this section of Constantinovka will be repainted again and repainted in some different way. In the southern part of Constantinovka, heavy fierce combat clashes continue. The Russian Federation is identifying positions, as well as points of temporary deployment of the armed forces of Ukraine on this section, against which strikes are immediately delivered using all the most powerful weaponry that the Russian Federation possesses, including FAB 3000. On these frames, we see how, as a result of another strike, practically the entire building was demolished. Precisely in this part, the most fierce, most heavy fighting is taking place now. Actually, Russian units, since the beginning of combat operations for the city of Constantinovka, managed to completely isolate the southwestern part of the city from the main part of Constantinovka due to the presence of rivers, due to destroyed crossings, bridges, as well as due to the establishment of full control over Azovskaya Street, and in connection with the fact that the garrison of the armed forces of Ukraine on this direction is maximally isolated. Actually, this part of the city has been taken into a kind of peculiar siege. But as you can see, again without any serious adjustments, That is, the time has not yet come for a large-scale ground operation, and there is an extremely high probability, based on the pace at which events are developing on this direction, there is an extremely high probability that ultimately and in the end, the city of Constantinovka, at least its southwestern part, will actually cease to exist, just as in its time the northern part of the settlement of Volchansk ceased to exist, which over long months of combat operations was simply wiped off the face of the earth. An analogous situation may occur at minimum with the southwestern part as well, precisely the main defensive line of the armed forces of Ukraine. Next, we move a bit north, toward the Slaviansk sector. From this section as well, a large quantity of important adjustments is arriving. Today, once again, pro-Ukrainian resources report that Russian units managed to infiltrate through the defensive lines of the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of the settlements of Golubovka, Minkovka, Privolye. On this section, significant adjustments are being recorded. This is how the map is changing over the outgoing day. The Russian army approached actually the last strong point on this direction, and we are talking about this forest massif. As soon as Russian units exit beyond the boundaries of this forest massif, options for moving further in bypass of Fedorovka-Vtorik will already appear. Or possibly the Russian side will attempt to test the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal with an attempt at forcing in the area of Malinovka. Although this section of the front is very fortified, and such an operation, of course, is unlikely, extremely unlikely. Also very important adjustments are arriving in the area of the settlement of Krivaya Luka. This is how the map was adjusted over the outgoing day. According to various analysts, Russian units managed to significantly improve their positions. More precisely here again is a grey zone. One needs to clearly and precisely understand what the grey zone means at the present moment. As such, a grey zone in all likelihood no longer exists. The grey zone at the present moment is a zone of infiltration of both units of the Russian army and units of the armed forces of Ukraine. But the adjustments or vector of adjustments indicates to us whose units are beginning an operation of infiltration onto these or those sections. And according to the latest adjustments, we see that Russian saboteurs are gradually infiltrating toward the settlement of Kalaniki, as well as to strong points located to the north, as well as to the western outskirts of the settlement of Reznikovka. Also, Russian units, in all likelihood, are completing the clearing of strategic heights located northeast of the settlement of Krivaya Luka. We are talking about these strong points, about these heights located along the Seversky Donets River. This is actually the main defensive line of the armed forces of Ukraine on the, if one can put it this way, Nikolaevka-Alexandrovsk section of the front. In case of advancement in the area of Krivaya Luka, and in case of full, if one can say so, advancement in the area of these heights, then holding the defense in the area of Kalaniki and Reznikovka will become maximally impossible. And then the front line here will crumble, and the Ukrainian army will be forced to roll back further to the west toward forest massifs, as well as toward Starodubovka, Rai-Alexandrovka, and of course toward the Slaviansk power station of the city of Nikolaevka, which in turn will already be the last extreme defensive line before the settlement of Slaviansk. On the Kupiansk direction, without changes. On the Kharkiv section of the front, quite actively in the last several days. At the present moment, the Russian army is occupied with a large spectrum of various issues, starting from strikes on temporary positions, on warehouses located somewhere in the area of Bely Kolodez. And also Russian units on the ground are actively storming and advancing in the area of a large forest massif, located between the Volkhya River and the state border. Russian aviation and Tios Sontsepyok flamethrower systems worked over this forest massif again. On these frames, we see strikes on positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, most likely still by Sontsepyok systems. And it is very important, if we increase the number of updates from February 1st, then we will see how intensively work is being conducted precisely on the northeastern section of this forest massif, which gives us grounds to suppose that the first strike will be delivered precisely on this direction with the goal of cutting the entire, if one can put it this way, section of the state border and defensive line of the AFU into two parts. One part between this section of the front, the forest massif and the Volchansk agglomeration, and the second part between this forest massif and the very northeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast. So here in the near future, one should expect fighting of very high intensity. And overall, if one analyzes the events that are now unfolding on the Kharkiv direction, then one can draw an unambiguous conclusion that, despite the statements of various analysts that the Kharkiv direction for the Russian Federation at this stage is secondary from the point of view of possibly value, interests, and activity. But if one proceeds from the quantity of those video materials that we receive, personally I draw an unambiguous conclusion that the Kharkiv direction, at least the Pechenegi direction, is the most priority for the Russian Federation. At least the territory up to this red line, these are the tasks that the Russian command of the Sever, North Force grouping sets for itself for the year 2026. Because one would like to remind that precisely from these sections, from this direction, the Ukrainian side delivers strikes on the territory of the city of Belgorod, on the territory of power stations, energy facilities. Therefore, from the point of view of the security of the city of Belgorod, this direction is maximally priority, and precisely this is what the Russian army will be engaged in all likelihood, in the coming several months. 6 to 8 months, well, in principle, the entire year 2026. Next, we move toward the Sumy direction. Today on this section, there is also an expansion of the grey zone, more precisely the infiltration zone. This is how the map looked on February 13th. On February 14th, an adjustment is being made in the area of the settlement of Kondratovka. The Russian army, in all likelihood, again began an offensive on this direction. I remind you that after the first wave of offensive on the Sumy section, Russian units managed to completely bypass and pass the settlement of Kondratovka and exit further to the south toward Khotin. However, subsequently, in the course of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, which was organized from the direction of the settlement of Yastrebinoye, the Ukrainian side managed to restore control over this settlement. And now we see the beginning of the third battle for this section of the front, and the Russian army is actively advancing with the goal of reaching, of course, the second section of the defensive node of the armed forces of Ukraine, located north of Sumy. These are the settlements of Khotin, Pisarevka, Novaya Sech, and Korchakovka. Active combat operations are already being conducted here, and the Sumy direction will also be one of the most priority for the Russian Federation for the year 2026. And that is all, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.